The moment someone tells you that you were never wanted is the moment you begin wondering whether you should have existed in their life at all. Aliana Voss stood at the center of Mooncrest Palace with her hands folded calmly in front of her, even though her heart felt anything but calm. The great hall stretched nearly 100 feet from end to end, filled with nobles, council members, military commanders, and representatives from every major pack in the kingdom. Hundreds of crystal lights glowed overhead, casting golden reflections across the polished marble floor. At 22 years old, Aliana had never imagined she would stand in a place like this. She had certainly never imagined becoming the center of attention for the entire kingdom. Yet that morning, everything had changed. The ancient ceremony of selection had returned for the first time in generations, and according to the elders, the moon goddess herself would reveal the future Luna. Aliana had spent the previous night hoping someone else would be chosen. Someone stronger, someone more confident, someone born for greatness. She had never considered herself any of those things. She was kind, hardworking, and loyal, but she had never dreamed of standing beside a king. Across the hall stood Alpha King Valar Ashthorn. Tall, composed, and powerful, he looked exactly like the ruler the kingdom admired. His silver eyes reflected the light of the chandeliers as nobles watched him with respect and admiration. Most women in the kingdom would have considered themselves fortunate simply to be noticed by him. Aliana had once believed the same thing. Then she had learned that admiration from afar was very different from being seen up close. The High Elder raised an ancient silver staff, and the room immediately fell silent. Every eye turned toward the ceremonial circle engraved into the marble floor. The symbols carved there were older than the kingdom itself. According to legend, they had been placed by the first followers of the moon goddess centuries ago. "Step forward," the High Elder announced. Aliana obeyed. The instant her foot crossed into the center of the circle, silver light erupted beneath her. Soft at first, then brighter. The symbols surrounding her illuminated one after another until the entire floor seemed alive with moonlight. Gasps echoed through the hall. Several elders exchanged stunned looks. Even the High Elder appeared overwhelmed. "The moon goddess has spoken," he declared. "Aliana Voss has been chosen." Applause immediately broke out around the room. Nobles smiled. Council members nodded approvingly. Some people even rose to their feet. But before the celebration could fully spread, another voice cut through the hall. Calm, cold, unmistakable. "I never wanted her." The applause died instantly. Silence swept through the room so completely that Aliana could hear her own breathing. Slowly, every person turned toward the Alpha King. Valar remained perfectly still. There was no anger in his voice, no cruelty. Somehow that made the words hurt even more. He sounded as though he were simply stating a fact. The High Elder blinked in disbelief. "Your Majesty?" Valar's gaze never left the ceremonial circle. "The moon goddess may have chosen her," he said evenly, "but I did not." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Aliana felt every eye move from him back to her. She knew what they were thinking. The chosen Luna. The unwanted Luna. The girl selected by destiny, but rejected by the man standing beside it. Her chest tightened, but she refused to cry. She refused to lower her head. Instead, she stood quietly beneath the silver light and accepted the humiliation with dignity. The ceremony continued, but nothing felt the same. The joy was gone. The excitement had vanished. And while whispers began spreading throughout the hall, something unexpected happened. The silver glow beneath Aliana suddenly brightened. Not once, but twice. The light pulsed gently around her like a heartbeat. Most people were too distracted by the king's words to notice. But from a shadowed balcony overlooking the hall, a hooded stranger noticed immediately. And as he watched the silver light surround Aliana, concern appeared on his face. Because he knew something the rest of the kingdom did not. The moon goddess had never made mistakes. Some wounds do not appear when the cruel words are spoken. They appear later, when the room is empty and nobody is watching. By the time the ceremony finally ended, the whispers had already spread through Mooncrest Palace. Servants carried them through hallways. Nobles repeated them behind polite smiles. Council members exchanged quiet glances whenever Aliana's name was mentioned. The chosen Luna had become the most talked about woman in the kingdom, yet not for the reason anyone had imagined only an hour earlier. Aliana walked through the eastern corridor alone, her ivory gown brushing softly against the polished floor. Moonlight filtered through tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, painting silver patterns across the walls. Normally, she loved this part of the palace. The gardens reminded her of home. Tonight, they only reminded her how far away home felt. As she turned a corner, two young noblewomen stepped out from a nearby sitting room. The moment they noticed her, their conversation stopped. One offered a polite smile. The other lowered her eyes. Neither woman said anything directly. They did not need to. Aliana could already see the pity on their faces. She continued walking. Her pace never changed. Her expression remained calm. That was what she had always done. When life became difficult, she stayed quiet and kept moving forward. Yet every step felt heavier than the one before. Hours later, the palace hosted a formal reception for visiting dignitaries. Music filled the grand ballroom. Crystal glasses reflected golden light. Guests laughed and celebrated as though nothing unusual had happened that day. Aliana attended because protocol required it. The future Luna could not simply disappear. She greeted ambassadors, thanked guests for their congratulations, smiled when expected, listened politely when people spoke to her. Most of them avoided mentioning the ceremony altogether. Somehow that hurt even more. Across the ballroom, Alpha King Valor stood surrounded by military leaders and council members. He appeared completely composed, confident, untouched by the storm he had created. Several times Aliana caught herself looking in his direction. Each time she immediately looked away. She was not angry. Anger would have been easier. Instead, she felt something much more painful. She felt embarrassed for existing in a place where she clearly did not belong. Near midnight, the reception finally ended. One by one, the guests departed. The palace slowly grew quiet. Aliana slipped away before anyone could stop her. She crossed a stone courtyard illuminated by moonlight and entered a small garden hidden behind the western wing of the palace. Few people knew about it. Fewer still visited after dark. It was peaceful there. A fountain stood in the center surrounded by white moonflowers. Their petals glowed softly beneath the night sky. For the first time all day, Aliana allowed herself to breathe. She sat on a stone bench beside the fountain and stared at the reflection of the moon in the water. The silence felt comforting. Safe. Her shoulders finally relaxed. She thought about the ceremony, about the shocked faces, about the whispers, about the way the entire hall had looked at her after Valor spoke. A small ache settled deep inside her chest. Not because she had been rejected, but because she suddenly understood something she had been trying not to admit. If the moon goddess had chosen someone else, Valor would probably be happier. The thought made her eyes sting. She blinked rapidly and looked toward the stars. Then, believing she was completely alone, she whispered words she had never intended anyone else to hear. "I am sorry I was chosen." Her voice trembled slightly. "I never wanted to make anyone unhappy." The fountain continued flowing quietly. The moonflowers swayed in the evening breeze. Aliana lowered her head and wiped a tear before it could fall. What she did not know was that she was not alone. Hidden behind a marble archway overlooking the garden stood the same hooded stranger who had watched the ceremony from the balcony. He had followed her there, and when he heard those words, genuine sorrow appeared in his eyes. Because the young woman chosen by destiny believed she was the problem. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, forces that had remained silent for years were already beginning to awaken. The people who carry the heaviest burdens are often the ones who complain the least. The days following the ceremony passed slowly for Aliana Voss, yet she refused to allow her disappointment to change the way she treated others. Every morning she rose before sunrise, long before most of the palace had awakened. While nobles still slept beneath silk blankets and servants prepared the day ahead, Aliana quietly began learning everything expected of a future Luna. She studied royal traditions, attended council briefings, reviewed reports from distant territories, and spent hours listening to advisors explain matters that would one day affect thousands of people across the kingdom. Nobody had asked her to work so hard. In truth, many people expected her to fail. Some believed she would eventually leave. Others assumed the Alpha King would convince the council to reverse the moon goddess's choice. Yet Aliana continued showing up every day with patience and determination. She did not do it for recognition. She did not do it to impress Valor. She simply believed that if fate had placed a responsibility in her hands, she should do her best to carry it. Several weeks later, a severe drought began affecting farming communities along the southern border. Water levels in local reservoirs dropped lower each day, and several villages reported concerns about upcoming harvests. The matter reached the royal council during a morning meeting. Advisors debated possible solutions for nearly 3 hours. Some argued for increased taxes to fund emergency transportation. Others suggested redirecting resources from neighboring regions. The discussion continued without progress. Aliana sat quietly near the end of the table, listening carefully. She rarely interrupted senior officials. When she finally spoke, several council members looked surprised. In a calm voice, she proposed reopening a network of abandoned irrigation channels that had once supplied water to the region generations earlier. Historical maps stored in the royal archives documented their locations. The restoration would cost far less than transporting water across hundreds of miles and could help farmers for years rather than months. The room fell silent. Advisors exchanged curious looks. Within days, engineers confirmed that her proposal would work. The project began immediately. Thousands of acres of farmland were expected to benefit. The official announcement praised the wisdom of the Royal Council. Nobody publicly mentioned that the idea had come from Aliana. She never corrected them. A few days later, she visited the palace infirmary carrying baskets of food and fresh flowers. Several elderly patients recognized her and thanked her for spending time with them. She listened to their stories for hours. She remembered their names. She returned the following week with books for those who enjoyed reading and blankets for those who felt cold at night. Again, she never asked anyone to tell the kingdom about her visits. She simply believed kindness mattered. Meanwhile, Valor remained distant. Their interactions were polite but brief. During council meetings, he acknowledged her suggestions when necessary. During public appearances, he treated her respectfully. Yet there was always an invisible wall between them. Aliana accepted it without complaint. If anything, she became even more careful not to create problems for him. One afternoon, she overheard two servants discussing recent improvements throughout the kingdom. "The future Luna seems different from the nobles," one remarked. "She actually listens." The other nodded. Most people do not realize how many of these ideas come from her. Aliana smiled quietly and continued walking before they noticed she had heard them. Praise felt nice, but it was never what motivated her. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains, the mysterious hooded stranger watched from another secluded balcony overlooking the palace grounds. For weeks, he had observed Aliana without revealing himself. Every day confirmed the same thing. She was not ambitious. She was not selfish. She was not seeking power. Yet somehow she continued helping everyone around her while believing she deserved none of the blessings she had received. The stranger's concern deepened. Because hidden inside an ancient chamber far beneath Mooncrest Palace lay records forgotten by nearly everyone alive. Records that described the last woman chosen by the moon goddess in exactly the same way. And according to those forgotten accounts, destiny had never selected Aliana merely to become a Luna. Sometimes the first crack in a person's certainty comes from witnessing a truth they never expected to find. Nearly 6 weeks had passed since the ceremony, and winter had settled firmly over Mooncrest Kingdom. Snow covered the rooftops of the palace, and icy winds swept across the mountains surrounding the capital. Inside the palace, however, life continued as usual. Advisors attended meetings. Servants hurried through endless corridors. Nobles focused on their own ambitions and concerns. Alpha King Valor Ashthorn spent most of his days managing affairs of the kingdom, but recently he had found himself noticing something strange. No matter how many reports crossed his desk, no matter how many responsibilities demanded his attention, his thoughts occasionally drifted toward Aliana Voss. Not because she caused problems. Quite the opposite. She seemed to make every situation easier for everyone around her. One afternoon, after a lengthy council session, Valor decided to inspect the royal infirmary. The visit was routine. The palace funded several healthcare programs throughout the capital, and periodic inspections were expected. As he entered the building, he noticed the atmosphere felt unusually warm despite the cold weather outside. Patients sat comfortably reading books. Fresh flowers decorated windowsills. Children played quietly near a fireplace while healers moved through the room, checking on patients. Everything appeared unusually cheerful. Valor was speaking with the head physician when a sudden burst of laughter echoed from the far side of the infirmary. He turned instinctively. The moment an 8-year-old girl spotted Aliana entering through the front door, she jumped from her chair and ran across the room. "You're back," the child exclaimed. Aliana laughed softly as she knelt down and opened her arms. The little girl wrapped her arms around her immediately. "Of course I came back," Aliana replied. "I told you I would." The child's face lit up with happiness. Several other patients smiled as they watched the reunion. Vaylor stood quietly where he was, observing from a distance. He had never seen this side of her before. There was no audience here, no council members, no nobles, no political advantage to gain. Yet everyone in the room seemed genuinely happy to see her. The Alpha King glanced toward the infirmary director standing beside him. She visits often? The older man looked surprised by the question. Every week. Vaylor frowned slightly. Every week. Without fail. The director pointed toward a nearby bookshelf filled with colorful children's stories. Those books were donated by her. He gestured toward several neatly folded blankets stacked nearby. Those too. Then he motioned toward a collection of wooden toys arranged beside the fireplace. And every toy in this room. Vaylor followed the man's gaze. For the first time, he noticed how many small improvements surrounded the patients. None carried royal insignias. None announced who had provided them. She asked us not to publicize any of it, the director continued. Most people in the palace have no idea how much she contributes here. Vaylor remained silent. Across the room, Aliana was helping the little girl choose a new book. Her smile looked natural, unforced, genuine. The child pointed excitedly to one of the stories and began explaining why it was her favorite. Aliana listened as though it were the most important conversation in the world. The director lowered his voice. The children adore her. The elderly patients do too. She remembers birthdays. She remembers names. She remembers details about their families. Most important people never do. Something about those words lingered with Vaylor. Important people never do. He found himself watching Aliana differently. For months he had viewed her as an obligation forced upon him by fate. Yet here she was, quietly improving lives without expecting praise, attention, or reward. Hours later, as Aliana prepared to leave, several children walked her to the entrance. One little boy hesitated before speaking. Will you still visit when you become Luna? The question seemed innocent. Yet the room suddenly grew quiet. Aliana smiled warmly at him. Then she gave an answer that caught Vaylor completely off guard. If they still want me here. The child immediately nodded. We will always want you here. Laughter spread through the room, but Vaylor did not laugh. He remained standing near the doorway as Aliana said goodbye and stepped outside into the falling snow. For reasons he could not explain, her words stayed with him long after she left. If they still want me here. She had been chosen by the moon goddess herself. Yet somehow she still sounded uncertain that anyone truly wanted her at all. And for the first time since the ceremony, that realization made Vaylor profoundly uncomfortable. Some words are forgotten within minutes. Others remain forever because they reveal a truth we were never prepared to hear. The days following Vaylor's visit to the royal infirmary were unlike any he had experienced before. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The kingdom continued functioning normally. Council meetings filled the mornings. Reports occupied the afternoons. Formal dinners and diplomatic obligations consumed the evenings. Yet beneath the routine, something inside him had shifted. More than once he found himself remembering the little girl who had run across the infirmary simply to hug Aliana. More than once he heard her answer repeating in his mind. If they still want me here. The words bothered him because they revealed something he had never considered. Despite everything she had done for the kingdom, Aliana still seemed uncertain of her place within it. The realization lingered long after the memory should have faded. Several nights later, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Vaylor left the palace to clear his thoughts. Snow covered the gardens in a blanket of silver beneath the moonlight. The air was cold and still. Most of the palace had already gone quiet. Without fully intending to, his steps carried him toward the secluded moonflower garden hidden behind the western wing. He had not visited the place since the evening he first noticed Aliana sitting there alone. As he approached, he noticed a soft glow from a lantern near the fountain. Someone was already there. Instinctively, he stopped. Through the marble archway, he saw Aliana seated on the familiar stone bench. Beside her stood Miriam, the elderly palace attendant who occasionally assisted with her responsibilities. Neither woman appeared aware of his presence. Vaylor remained hidden in the shadows. He should have left. Instead, he stayed. The two women spoke quietly about preparations for an upcoming charity project. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward more personal matters. Miriam looked at Aliana with concern. You work harder than anyone in this palace, yet you never give yourself credit for any of it. Aliana smiled faintly. There are many people who work harder than I do. Miriam shook her head. That is not true. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Snowflakes drifted through the moonlight. The fountain flowed softly behind them. Then Miriam asked a question that changed everything. If you could go back to the day of the ceremony, would you change anything? Aliana lowered her eyes. The smile disappeared from her face. Several seconds passed before she answered. Yes. Valor felt his attention sharpen instantly. Miriam looked surprised. You would? Aliana nodded slowly. I would ask the moon goddess to choose someone else. Silence followed. Valor stared at her in disbelief. Miriam moved closer. Why would you say that? Aliana looked toward the frozen fountain. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because everything would have been easier. Her words carried no bitterness, no resentment, only sadness. The kingdom would have been happier. The council would have been happier. She paused briefly, and he would have been happier. Valor felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. Miriam immediately objected. You cannot know that. Aliana smiled sadly. I heard his voice that day. I remember every word. The fountain continued flowing. Snow continued falling. The world seemed impossibly quiet. Then came the sentence that Valor would remember for the rest of his life. I am sorry I was chosen. The words were soft, fragile, honest, not spoken for sympathy, not spoken for attention, spoken because she truly believed them. Valor remained completely still. In that moment, every assumption he had carried since the ceremony began collapsing beneath the weight of a simple truth. Aliana had never blamed him. She had never sought revenge. She had never complained. Instead, she had spent months carrying guilt for something that was never her fault. Miriam's eyes filled with sadness. My dear, none of this belongs on your shoulders. Aliana looked away. A single tear escaped before she quietly wiped it away. She did not cry. She did not break down. She simply sat there beneath the moonlight, carrying a burden nobody had asked her to bear. For reasons Valor could not explain, that lone tear hurt more than any accusation ever could. He remained hidden until both women finally left the garden. Long after they disappeared, he stayed where he was. Snow gathered on his shoulders. The cold no longer mattered. For the first time since the moon goddess had chosen Aliana Voss, Alpha King Valor Ashthorn found himself unable to escape a single devastating question. What if the person who deserved an apology was not him, but her? The truth becomes impossible to ignore when it begins appearing everywhere you look. After the night in the Moonflower Garden, Valor Ashthorn could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. The image of Aliana sitting beneath the falling snow remained fixed in his mind. Her apology, her sadness, the single tear she had tried so hard to hide. For weeks he had searched for reasons to justify the assumptions he made after the ceremony. Now, for the first time, he found himself searching for reasons those assumptions might have been wrong. Several days later, he left the palace without announcing his destination. Dressed simply and accompanied by only a single guard, he traveled to a small village less than 30 miles from the capital. One of the reports he had reviewed mentioned a community school that had recently expanded despite limited funding. Curious, he decided to see it himself. When he arrived, children filled the modest building with laughter and energy. The school was not grand. The wooden floors were worn, and the classrooms were small. Yet the students seemed genuinely happy. An elderly teacher greeted him and proudly showed him around. During the visit, Valor noticed a familiar name displayed on a plaque near the entrance. Aliana Voss. He paused. What did she do here? The teacher smiled immediately. This school almost closed 3 winters ago. Valor looked surprised. The teacher continued. The roof was leaking. We could not afford repairs. Many families were preparing to send their children elsewhere. He pointed toward the classrooms. Lady Aliana organized donations, found volunteers, and raised enough money to keep the school open. The teacher's expression softened. Most of these children would not be here without her. Valor remained silent. As he walked through the building, he noticed dozens of students studying, reading, and learning in classrooms that existed because someone had quietly cared enough to help. Later that afternoon, he visited a nearby community center mentioned in another report. There he met an elderly woman who recognized Aliana's name instantly. That young lady, she said with a smile. She helped us during the harsh winter 2 years ago. Valor listened carefully. How? The woman gestured towards several older residents sitting comfortably near a fireplace. Many of us could not afford heating supplies that year. Somehow she found assistance before anyone even asked. The woman laughed softly. She always seemed to know what people needed before they said anything. Everywhere Valor went, the story remained the same. Different people, different places, different circumstances. Yet every conversation revealed another act of kindness that had never appeared in official announcements. By the time he returned to Mooncrest Palace, the weight of what he was learning had become impossible to ignore. That evening he visited the archives once more. This time he was not looking for evidence. He was looking for understanding. Near the bottom of a storage box, he discovered records related to Aliana's personal history. Several documents immediately caught his attention. 3 separate marriage proposals from some of the most influential families in the kingdom. Each proposal offered wealth, status, and enormous political advantages. Each proposal had been declined. Valor frowned. If Aliana had ever desired power, she could have gained it years ago. Curious, he continued reading. Eventually, he discovered correspondence explaining her decisions. She had refused every proposal because she did not believe respect could be replaced by influence. She wanted a meaningful life, not a powerful title. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Then, tucked between several old papers, he found a folded letter written entirely in Aliana's handwriting. It had never been sent. He hesitated before opening it. The words inside were simple and painfully honest. She wrote about her fears, her doubts, and her uncertainty regarding the moon goddess's selection. There was no excitement about becoming Luna, no dreams of power, no ambition. Then he reached the final lines. If someone else is chosen, I will be relieved. If I am chosen, I will do my best. Either way, I only hope the future Luna makes him happy. Valor stopped reading. For a long moment he stared at the page without moving. The woman he had spent months misunderstanding had never wanted the crown. She had never wanted recognition. She had never even wanted to be chosen. Yet she had accepted every burden placed upon her shoulders and carried it without complaint. Slowly, Valor folded the letter and closed his eyes. For the first time since the ceremony, he understood a truth he could no longer escape. Aliana had spent months proving her worth to everyone around her. The only person she had never needed to prove anything to was him. And somehow, he had been the last person to see it. Some people enter your life quietly, and only later do you realize they have the power to change everything. News of King Riker Thornvale's arrival spread quickly throughout Mooncrest Palace. The ruler of the Northern Dominion rarely traveled beyond his own territory, and when he did, it was always for matters of great importance. By the time his delegation reached the capital, nobles filled the palace with speculation. Some expected trade negotiations. Others anticipated military discussions. Very few understood the true significance of the visit. On the morning of his arrival, the Great Hall welcomed guests from both kingdoms. Snow still covered the mountains beyond the palace windows, but inside, golden light from hundreds of chandeliers illuminated the gathering. Aliana stood beside several council members reviewing documents related to regional development projects. She had volunteered to help organize discussions concerning education and healthcare initiatives between the 2 kingdoms. It was exactly the sort of work she enjoyed. Practical, meaningful, focused on helping people rather than politics. When King Riker finally entered the hall, conversations immediately quieted. He carried himself with calm confidence rather than arrogance. Unlike many rulers, he seemed genuinely comfortable speaking with everyone around him regardless of rank or status. After greeting the council, his attention settled briefly on Aliana. Lady Aliana, he said warmly. It is a pleasure to finally meet you. Aliana appeared surprised. Finally, Riker smiled. I have been hearing about you for months. Several nearby nobles exchanged curious looks. Aliana laughed softly. I suspect those stories were greatly exaggerated. Actually, Riker replied, I suspect they were incomplete. The simple response earned another smile from her. Valor observed the exchange from across the hall. Something about the conversation unsettled him, though he could not immediately explain why. Over the following days, Riker participated in numerous meetings throughout the palace. During each one, he seemed unusually interested in Aliana's opinions. When discussions focused on education, he asked for her recommendations. When conversations turned toward community development, he requested her insights. More importantly, he listened carefully whenever she spoke. Unlike many nobles who merely waited for their turn to talk, Riker appeared genuinely interested in her ideas. Aliana gradually relaxed in his presence. Their conversations became easier, more natural. For the first time in months, people noticed her laughing openly during public events. Valor noticed too. One afternoon, he entered the royal library searching for a set of economic reports. Instead, he found Aliana and Riker seated near a large window overlooking the snowy gardens. Maps and planning documents covered the table between them. They were discussing strategies for improving access to schools in remote villages. At some point, Riker made an observation that caused Aliana to laugh. The sound caught Vaylor completely off guard. He stopped walking without realizing it. He could not remember the last time he had seen her look that relaxed, that comfortable. For reasons he could not explain, the sight bothered him. Several days later, the Royal Council hosted a formal strategy session attended by representatives from both kingdoms. During the meeting, discussion turned toward future cooperation. Advisors proposed various programs and exchanges. Then Riker unexpectedly stood. The room fell silent. "There is something I would like to say publicly," he announced. Curious looks spread throughout the chamber. Riker glanced toward Aliana before addressing the council. "Over the past week, I have had the privilege of witnessing the remarkable contributions Lady Aliana has made to this kingdom." Several council members nodded. Others listened carefully. "What surprises me," Riker continued, "is not how valuable her work has been. It is how often that value goes unrecognized." The room became noticeably quieter. Then Riker delivered the statement that would leave the entire hall speechless. "If Mooncrest cannot fully appreciate what it has been given, the Northern Dominion certainly can." Silence crashed through the chamber. Some nobles stared openly. Others looked toward Vaylor. Even the council members appeared stunned. Riker's meaning was impossible to misunderstand. He was not speaking merely about projects or policies. He was speaking about Aliana herself. Across the room, Vaylor felt an unfamiliar tension settle deep inside his chest. For months he had assumed Aliana would always remain exactly where she was. Yet for the first time, someone had openly suggested a future in which she belonged somewhere else. Somewhere she would be appreciated. Somewhere she would be chosen. As the meeting finally continued, Vaylor found it increasingly difficult to focus. Because a troubling realization had begun taking shape in his mind. Other people were starting to see exactly what he had failed to see. And eventually, someone else might decide they were unwilling to let her go. The moment you realize someone can leave is often the moment you finally understand how much they mattered. The days following Riker Thornvale's statement before the Royal Council felt strangely different inside Mooncrest Palace. Although official business continued as usual, an unspoken tension lingered beneath every conversation. Nobles discussed the Northern King's words behind closed doors. Advisors quietly debated what they might mean for future diplomatic relations. Servants carried rumors through hallways and courtyards. Yet the person most affected by the situation remained completely unaware of the storm unfolding around her. Aliana continued focusing on her work exactly as she always had. She reviewed educational initiatives, coordinated community programs, and spent time at the Royal Infirmary whenever her schedule allowed. If anything, she seemed happier than before. Her recent collaboration with Riker had opened new possibilities she had never considered. For years, she had wanted to help more people than her position allowed. Now, for the first time, someone was offering her an opportunity to do exactly that. A week later, Riker requested a private meeting with the Royal Council. The discussion lasted nearly 2 hours. When the meeting ended, news spread through the palace faster than anyone expected. The Northern Dominion had formally offered Aliana a permanent position as Royal Humanitarian Advisor. The role would allow her to oversee educational programs, healthcare initiatives, and community development projects throughout multiple territories. It was an extraordinary opportunity. More importantly, it was entirely her choice. Nobody could force her to accept or reject it. When the proposal was presented to her later that afternoon, Aliana sat quietly for several moments before responding. "You would trust me with that responsibility?" she asked. Riker smiled. "I trust what I have seen. You improve every place you touch." The sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt. For perhaps the first time since the moon goddess had chosen her, Aliana felt genuinely valued. Not because of destiny, not because of prophecy, not because of a title, simply because of who she was. 3 days later, she accepted. The decision shocked much of the palace. Several council members attempted to persuade her to reconsider. Others congratulated her warmly. Aliana thanked them all with her usual kindness, but her mind was already moving toward the future. The Northern Dominion represented a fresh beginning, a place where she would not constantly remember the ceremony, a place where nobody viewed her through the shadow of someone else's rejection. Across the palace, Valor received the news in complete silence. He dismissed the messenger and remained alone in his office for nearly an hour. Rationally, he understood why she had accepted. The position suited her perfectly. She would help thousands of people. She would finally receive the respect she deserved. Yet none of those facts made the reality easier to accept. Over the following week, preparations for her departure began. At first, the changes were subtle. A few books disappeared from shelves. Documents were sorted into storage boxes. Personal belongings gradually vanished from common workspaces. Then one evening, while walking through the palace after a council session, Valor passed Aliana's suite. The door stood partially open. Without intending to, he glanced inside. The sight stopped him cold. Wooden travel trunks lined one wall. Shelves that had once held books now stood half empty. The writing desk where she spent countless hours working contained only a few remaining papers. The room no longer looked like someone's home. It looked like someone preparing to leave forever. Valor remained standing there long after he should have continued walking. For months he had convinced himself there would always be more time, more opportunities, more conversations, more chances to make things right. Yet now every empty shelf seemed to whisper the same uncomfortable truth. Time was running out. Later that night, unable to sleep, he found himself standing once again beside the Moonflower Garden fountain. Snow had finally begun melting, replaced by the first signs of spring. The water flowed freely beneath the moonlight. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge what he had been avoiding for weeks. He was not afraid of losing a future Luna. He was afraid of losing Aliana. The realization struck with undeniable clarity. And as he stared at the reflection of the moon shimmering across the water, another realization followed close behind. If he remained silent much longer, he might spend the rest of his life watching someone else choose the woman he should have valued from the very beginning. A single moment can change the course of a life, but only if someone finds the courage to stop running from the truth. The morning of Aliana's departure arrived beneath clear spring skies. Sunlight poured through the towering windows of Mooncrest Palace, while servants carried luggage toward the royal courtyard. Representatives from the Northern Dominion prepared for the journey home. Nobles gathered throughout the palace to witness the farewell ceremony. Although officially presented as a diplomatic event, everyone understood its deeper significance. Aliana Voss was leaving Mooncrest Kingdom behind. Standing near the center of the Great Hall, she looked calm and composed. Her silver-blue gown reflected the morning light, and for the first time in many months there was a quiet confidence in her expression. She had spent years wondering where she belonged. Now she finally believed she had a chance to discover the answer. Nearby, King Riker Thornvale stood ready to accompany her to the Northern Dominion. Throughout the previous weeks, he had treated her with unwavering respect and kindness. He had never pressured her, never demanded anything from her. He had simply offered an opportunity and trusted her to choose for herself. Around them, members of the Royal Council exchanged polite farewells while guests filled the chamber. Yet one person had not arrived. Valor Ashthorn. As the ceremony began, whispers spread through the crowd. Some believed he had chosen not to attend. Others assumed royal duties had prevented him from coming. Aliana tried not to think about it. After everything that had happened, she no longer expected anything from him. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and began the formal proceedings. Speeches were delivered. Diplomatic agreements were acknowledged. Final preparations were announced. Then, just as the farewell blessing was about to begin, the massive doors at the end of the hall opened. Silence swept across the room. Every head turned. Valor stood in the doorway. For a moment, nobody moved. Then he began walking forward. Not toward the council. Not toward the throne. Toward Aliana. The entire hall watched in stunned silence. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Aliana's heart began racing. She could not understand what was happening. Neither could anyone else. Valor stopped directly in front of her. The distance between them felt impossibly small after months of emotional separation. For several seconds, he simply looked at her. Then something happened that nobody in the kingdom would ever forget. The Alpha King lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps erupted throughout the hall. Several nobles looked genuinely shocked. Even members of the royal council stared in disbelief. No one could remember a ruler of Mooncrest ever doing such a thing in public. Aliana's eyes widened. "Your Majesty," she whispered. Valor shook his head gently. Then he spoke loudly enough for every person in the hall to hear. "Months ago, I stood in this room and judged someone I never truly understood. Complete silence followed. I believed I knew what kind of person destiny had chosen. His voice remained steady, but emotion was impossible to hide. I was wrong. No one interrupted. No one dared. Valor kept his eyes on Aliana. You spent months helping people who could offer you nothing in return. You gave your time, your compassion, and your strength without asking for recognition. You carried responsibilities that were never yours to carry. His expression softened. And while you were doing all of that, you blamed yourself for mistakes that belonged to me. Aliana felt tears forming in her eyes. Valor continued. You were never the mistake. The words hung in the air. I was. Several people in the crowd quietly wiped their eyes. Others stood completely motionless. Valor drew a slow breath before speaking again. I rejected the greatest gift the moon goddess ever placed before me because I was too proud to see the truth. His next words seemed to stop time itself. If you still choose to leave today, I will respect your decision. Aliana stared at him. But this time, I want you to hear something I should have said long ago. The hall remained silent enough to hear a heartbeat. I choose you. Tears finally slipped down Aliana's cheeks. Valor's voice softened. Not because destiny chose you. He held her gaze. Because I finally do. At that exact moment, a warm silver light filled the hall. Ancient symbols carved into the marble floor began glowing softly beneath their feet. Gasps echoed through the chamber as moonlight streamed through the windows and surrounded them both. Even the hooded stranger standing among the guests smiled knowingly. The prophecy had never been about power. It had never been about a throne. It had always been about choice. Slowly, Aliana extended her hand. Valor looked at it in disbelief. Then she helped him rise to his feet. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Because for the first time since the moon goddess had brought their paths together, they were no longer standing together because of fate. They were standing together because they had finally chosen each other.